Sirens illuminated the white facade of a Miami mansion, reflecting hues of blue and red on the golden gates. Inside, a black briefcase lay open on the grand piano, revealing illegal contracts and millions of dollars in dark ink. Reporters were already announcing in firm voices, "Dirty money scandal destroys tycoon Robert Caldwell's secret empire." But what no one knew was that behind this headline lay much darker secrets: family betrayals, political bribery, and dirty dealings that grew like a sandcastle on the brink of collapse. Stay until the end, because this isn't just the downfall of a millionaire. It's proof that when fortune is born from corruption, it always ends in ruin. Robert Caldwell was the living embodiment of the American dream. The son of a bankrupt broker, he built his fortune in Miami by buying up derelict land and transforming it into luxury beachfront resorts. In the public eye, he was a business genius, a visionary who created empires from nothing. But behind every gleaming skyscraper lay shady deals, dirty money, and alliances no one dared mention. His Coral Gables mansion looked like something out of a Hollywood movie. Italian marble in the hallways, Greek sculptures in the gardens, and an underground vault housing over $100 million in gold bars. Guests described his parties as ostentatious spectacles. Politicians, artists, and business people toasting with $10,000 champagne. But amid the laughter and toasts, rumors of corruption and bribery circulated, fueling his rise. At that time, Robert surrounded himself with influential figures: senators, judges, renowned lawyers. He believed that a fortune only lasted when protected by powerful men. But by getting too close to politics, he also opened the door to betrayals that would soon become fatal. Money bought silence, but it didn't cover one's tracks. And his family? His elegant wife, Margaret, was a regular fixture in society columns, always flaunting rare jewels and dresses by European designers. But behind her impeccable appearance, she knew her marriage was tainted by hidden lovers and shameful secrets. Her eldest son, Daniel, dreamed of inheriting the empire, but grew resentful of his father's distrust. And her youngest daughter, Emily, was involved in secret parties that the tycoon would never approve. With each new venture, rumors of dirty dealings emerged. Shell companies, offshore accounts, contracts signed in closed rooms with corrupt politicians. Caldwell believed himself untouchable, but he didn't realize that the same system that protected him was also arming itself against him. An empire built on corruption doesn't need external enemies. A traitor at home is enough. The first signs of a rift came when a longtime partner, Richard Evans, began questioning financial transactions. He knew money was disappearing from key accounts. When he confronted Caldwell at a dinner party, he received only a cold smile and a cryptic sentence: "Some truths should remain buried." It was a warning, but also a veiled threat. Meanwhile, investigative journalists began to sniff out clues. A Washington reporter known for exposing multi-million-dollar scandals received anonymous documents linking Caldwell to inflated public works contracts. The evidence was still tenuous, but enough to sow doubt in the hearts of investors and political enemies. The seemingly solid fortune was beginning to lose credibility. In private meetings, Caldwell became increasingly paranoid. He ordered cell phones turned off, checked rooms for eavesdropping, and even distrusted his own security guards. His empire still gleamed before the cameras, but within the walls of the mansion, the atmosphere was one of suffocating tension. Who could be betraying him? Who would dare to risk everything? At a party, his daughter Emily heard whispers that her father's downfall was already being plotted. Close friends suggested that a comprehensive dossier was circulating among rival senators, poised to destroy not only his business, but also the entire family's reputation. Emily laughed at the time, but those words would echo in her mind for nights. Robert believed he could buy time, just as he bought lawyers, politicians, and partners. But time, unlike men, cannot be sold. He walked silently, setting the stage for the inevitable revelation. With each contract signed with dark money, with each concealed betrayal, an invisible thread pulled him toward the abyss. And then, an almost unnoticed detail changed the course of history. A black envelope left on his desk with no return address. Inside, a single handwritten sentence, "All secrets come to light." Caldwell didn't show it to anyone, but he knew this was just the beginning of the collapse of his empire. Newspaper columns celebrated Caldwell as a modern visionary. Business magazines called him the man who reinvented Miami. But what no one saw were the secret meetings in hotel suites where contracts were signed at midnight over glasses of imported whiskey. It was in these gatherings that the dirty dealings, invisible to the public eye, were born. Caldwell learned early on that fortune isn't built on cement and steel alone, but also on favors. He financed political campaigns and in return received access to land that magically appreciated overnight. This cycle of corruption repeated itself like clockwork, transforming every dirty dollar into gleaming skyscrapers. Margaret, his wife, knew his secrets, but preferred gilded silence. While flaunting diamond necklaces at gala balls, she pretended to ignore his late-night phone calls and sudden trips. Her luxury was bought with betrayal, and though her heart bled silently, she never dared confront her husband. After all, her entire life depended on that fortune. The sons, however, were not so blind. Daniel, the heir, suspected that the family wealth hid something rotten. He tried to prove his worth within the business, but Caldwell kept him from important decisions. A shadow of distrust grew between father and son, fueled by rumors that Daniel was secretly meeting with rival lawyers. Emily, in turn, became the rebellious daughter. She frequented parties at exclusive clubs where drugs, gambling, and dangerous relationships were common. It was whispered that she kept shocking revelations about the family's hidden life in her diary. Caldwell had no idea that a young woman could hold such dangerous keys to the future of the empire. Meanwhile, partner Richard Evans continued his investigation. At a cocktail party, he watched Caldwell from afar, analyzing every gesture, every word. When he finally approached, he blurted out, "Robert, even gold can rot when buried in mud." It was the first time Caldwell realized his decades-long friend was no longer trustworthy. In the world of finance, small signs began to spread. Partner banks delayed contracts. Investors questioned balance sheets. The empire seemed solid, but one only had to look between the lines to realize there were inconsistent figures, numbers doctored to hide the internal rot. To protect himself, Caldwell hired a new lawyer, the enigmatic Victor Hale. A cool, soft-spoken man with a calculating gaze, he promised to shield the empire from any attack, but the price of this legal silence was high, and his presence planted even more secrets in the family's heart. One night, Margaret found Hale talking quietly with Daniel in the mansion's garden. The words were cut off by the wind, but one of them was clear: heritage. His mother's face paled. The throne was already being contested before Caldwell even considered his succession. Caldwell's fortune seemed untouchable, but every gesture concealed invisible cracks. He smiled in interviews, but behind the scenes he yelled at subordinates, demanded absolute loyalty, and punished any misstep. Many said that working for him was like living in a gilded castle, surrounded by invisible chains. One morning, one of his drivers found a crumpled note in the back seat of the limousine. "The rot is about to emerge." Caldwell never knew where it came from, but he had all the security guards replaced. His eyes no longer closed easily. Fear began to eat away at his mind. Politicians who had once defended him now treated him warily. Washington had its own conspiracies, and Caldwell was about to become a disposable pawn. Bribes that had once bought silence now became evidence stored in locked folders. With each new party, with each new toast, the shadow of betrayal lengthened. Guests laughed but whispered in the background. No one dared confront him directly, but everyone knew something was about to happen. The downfall of a tycoon rarely begins with a visible blow. It is born of whispers. Caldwell's empire wasn't just about business, it was about control. He believed he could manipulate people like chess pieces, but he forgot that even the king can be cornered. The board was already set, and his adversaries were no longer visible. Daniel secretly began visiting a Swiss bank. There, he sought to open accounts in his own name, suspecting that the inheritance might slip away. The son tried to protect what he believed was rightfully his, unaware that he was becoming one of his own father's greatest traitors. Margaret, alone in her gilded room, wrote letters that were never sent. In them, she confessed her fear that all this luxury was just a prison in disguise. Tears fell onto the paper, blurring words like corruption and ruin. Maybe she knew more than she let on. Caldwell still believed he was master of destiny. But with each signed contract, each buried secret, his fortune turned into a trap. What he didn't know was that soon the empire built on corruption would be put to the test, and the first betrayal would come from where he least expected it. On that muggy Miami morning, Robert Caldwell walked into his private office and found a stamped envelope on his desk. There was no return address. Inside was a copy of his original will, but with an additional clause he had never written. The final sentence read, "Your assets will be frozen in the event of a federal investigation." The tycoon was shocked. The handwriting was familiar, but it wasn't his. It could only have come from someone close to him, someone with access to the most secret documents. Caldwell felt his heart race, but he maintained his composure. A man like him couldn't show weakness, even when faced with a harbinger of his own downfall. He immediately summoned attorney Victor Hale, who examined the paper in silence. Hale ran his fingers over the document and said coldly, "This shouldn't exist. But if it's already circulating, someone has the key to your safe." The sentence echoed like a sentence. Caldwell realized the golden walls protecting him were being breached from within. That night, Margaret noticed her husband pacing restlessly around the library. He didn't open any books, didn't answer any questions, just lit one cigar after another. "Robert, what happened?" she asked. He simply replied, "When betrayal comes from home, there's no way to build walls high enough." Margaret shuddered. The children, unbeknownst to them, were already vying for the throne of fortune. Daniel demanded access to the contracts, saying he needed to prepare for the future. Emily silently kept compromising details in her diary of secret meetings she had witnessed by chance. Each family member was a loose cannon, ready to turn against the other. Meanwhile, the press was moving in. Headlines appeared in New York newspapers. Caldwell's fortune may be built on illegal contracts. TV shows showed images of his resorts and asked venomously, luxury or slop? The tycoon felt the pressure of public opinion like a sledgehammer on his reputation. Richard Evans, the suspicious partner, finally decided to act. He sent copies of financial reports to a senator rival to Caldwell. In exchange, he asked for protection should the empire collapse. Evans knew he was risking his own life, but he also knew he wouldn't survive being an accomplice to the end. The first stab had already been struck. One morning, Caldwell was awakened by voices in the garden. He peeked out the window and saw Daniel arguing with Victor Hale. The lawyer was saying, "Without this document, there's no way to freeze the fortune, but with it, everything changes." Daniel didn't notice his father watching. In that moment, Robert knew the betrayal was no longer lurking. It had already arrived. The tycoon began rummaging through his safes. In one of them, he found signs of a break-in. Papers were out of order. A contract was missing. Amidst the piles of gold bars and dollars, a key piece was now missing. Whoever had dared to touch the heart of his wealth would surely pay dearly. Caldwell vowed revenge. That same day, Emily was seen in an upscale cafe, handing over her diary to a journalist in exchange for money. She believed she was simply protecting her own future, but she never imagined that every word she wrote would be a lethal weapon against her father's empire. Intimate secrets were about to become headlines. An anonymous phone call confirmed Caldwell's worst fears. A federal investigation had been launched. Quiet agents were already stalking his businesses, requesting documents, reviewing contracts. His lawyers talked about time and defense, but Caldwell felt the tide of his fortunes turning. Nothing seemed safe, not even his own home. During a lavish dinner, Margaret noticed that the guests whispered more than they laughed. One senator avoided toasting Robert, claiming he was unwell. Another left the table early. The isolation was beginning to show. The man who had once been the center of attention was now an unwelcome guest. Fortune became a prison. Caldwell spent hours locked in his office, trying to decipher who was the most dangerous enemy: the silent wife, the ambitious son, the rebellious daughter, the treacherous partner, or the cold lawyer. The empire fell not from external attacks, but from the poison seeping within its own walls. One night, upon opening a secret drawer, Robert found a cassette recording. The voice belonged to Richard Evans, describing dirty dealings, bribes, and falsified contracts. The tycoon crushed the tape against the floor, but he already knew. If one copy had reached him, others were already scattered in dangerous hands. The climax of this turning point came when, in the middle of the night, the mansion gates opened to federal agents. They had no arrest warrant, but they served a subpoena for questioning. Caldwell, dressed in black silk, descended the stairs and faced the men in silence. His expression spoke volumes. The empire was under siege. Margaret, watching from the balcony, felt a deep chill. She knew all that luxury was about to turn to ash. She thought of the letters tucked away in the drawer, of the fears she had written in secret. Perhaps it was time to protect herself, even if it meant sacrificing her husband. Meanwhile, Daniel smiled alone in his room. For him, his father's downfall was an opportunity to become the new owner of the fortune. He didn't understand that by participating in the game of betrayal, he had also become hostage to secrets that could destroy him. Youth blinded him to the abyss that lay ahead. Emily, in tears, realized too late the weight of what she had given the journalist. The diary was already being copied, sold, and spread. Her daughter's innocent confidences were now ammunition for powerful enemies. The silence of her youth had a price, and it would be paid in blood and ruin. Robert Caldwell went upstairs to his room and looked at himself in the gilded mirror. Behind his own image, he saw ghosts, hands stained with corruption, contracts covered in dust, looks of betrayal. He whispered to himself, "The empire has fallen, and I was the one who opened the doors." In the reflection, he no longer saw a millionaire, but a condemned man. News of the federal investigation spread like wildfire. Within days, newspapers from New York to Los Angeles were splashing headlines about illegal contracts and dirty money. The Caldwell name, once synonymous with fortune and success, now bore the weight of corruption. The tycoon realized the race against time had begun. The atmosphere in the mansion was suffocatingly silent. Employees avoided eye contact with their boss, fearing sudden dismissal or worse. Caldwell walked the halls like a ghost, suspicious of every face. He knew that betrayal always lurked beneath the mask of loyalty, and everyone was suspect here. Victor Hale, the lawyer, intensified his presence. He spent entire nights reviewing documents, burning papers in marble fireplaces, and muttering words that sounded like codes. Some employees swore they'd seen him hide files in secret compartments. Caldwell, however, didn't confront him. He feared discovering a truth he couldn't bear. Richard Evans, the associate, had become a central figure in the conspiracy. Protected by Caldwell's political rivals, he handed over evidence in exchange for promises of immunity. His meetings took place in discreet hotels, always at midnight. He believed himself out of danger, but he didn't realize that the Miami Mafia itself was beginning to stalk him. Meanwhile, Daniel was already acting as the heir to the empire. He gathered advisors, called meetings, and spoke of a survival strategy. His gestures were those of an impatient heir, but behind them lay only ambition. Caldwell watched silently, feeling the sting of seeing his own son use his downfall as a springboard. Margaret, previously submissive, began hatching her own plan. She discreetly sought out a renowned journalist and insinuated that she possessed exclusive information about her husband's hidden fortune. In return, she demanded guarantees that her name would never be exposed. For her, silence was worth more than love, and it had a price. Emily, the rebellious daughter, was overcome with guilt. She tried to retrieve the diary she had given her, but it was too late. The pages were already circulating in newsrooms, courtrooms, and senators' offices. Every innocently written line now came to life as a deadly accusation. She wept, but Caldwell no longer had the patience for consolation. On the political stage, Washington no longer hid its thirst for revenge. Senators who had previously toasted Caldwell now spoke out against corruption on national television. Every public word was a stone thrown at his image. He, who had bought so much silence, was now the target of deafening voices. The tycoon tried to fight back. He sent huge sums to intermediaries, trying to bribe judges and influence prosecutors. But the system was too corrupt even for him. The money that once bought power now disappeared like sand through one's fingers. Caldwell was discovering that no currency can buy truth. Meanwhile, his once loyal security detail began disappearing. Some abandoned their posts, others were seen negotiating information with the press. Caldwell began sleeping with a loaded gun by his bed, convinced that betrayal could walk through his door at any moment. The mansion had become a gilded prison. In Miami, rumors swirled in casinos and private clubs. Caldwell was bankrupt, selling off properties in a hurry. The elite treated him with contempt, as if his fortune were dust blown away. Friendships he'd bought evaporated, leaving only loneliness. The tycoon realized that nothing is crueler than the abandonment of those who once applauded him. Richard Evans, in his arrogance, believed he was safe. But one night, he was followed by men in dark suits. He entered his hotel but was never seen again. Days later, a gold watch, a gift from Caldwell, appeared at the bottom of a Miami canal. The conspiracy claimed its own victims. Daniel, upon learning of Evans's disappearance, felt fear for the first time. He sought out Victor Hale for answers, but the lawyer merely replied, "When you open the box of secrets, no one controls what comes out." The sentence sounded like a warning, but also like a prophecy. The young heir was trapped in the same deadly game. Margaret intensified her contacts with journalists. At discreet dinners, she hinted at documents confirming million-dollar bribes. At the same time, she amassed small fortunes in offshore accounts. Her strategy was clear. If the empire fell, she would fall on her feet, protected by a cushion of sold secrets. Caldwell, increasingly paranoid, began recording conversations inside his own home. He listened to them in silence, searching for clues as to who was betraying him. On one of them, he overheard Emily confessing to a friend, "My father is surrounded, and maybe it's for the best." This was the final blow. The tycoon felt he had no allies left. The streets of Miami were awash with media. Drones flew over his mansion, journalists camped out at the gates, headlines flashed on giant screens, "A tycoon's downfall, Caldwell's fortune in ruins." Public exposure was the greatest humiliation for a man who had lived by his image. Now it was a spectacle of decadence. By then, Caldwell was no longer in control of his own destiny. Lawsuits were piling up, allies were evaporating, and the family was fragmenting. The empire built on corruption and dark money was crumbling before America's eyes. The tycoon, silently, understood the cruel moral. No fortune is large enough to hide all its secrets. Guests arrived in imported cars, passing through the golden gates of the Caldwell mansion. Women in sparkling dresses, men in impeccable suits. Robert had planned this dinner to demonstrate his strength, to prove he was still Miami's untouchable mogul. But behind every smile, the anticipation of his downfall grew. The main room gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, long silver-draped tables reflected the grandeur of the moment. Caldwell climbed a few steps and opened his arms, like a conductor before the orchestra of his own fortune. "Let's toast the future," he said, raising his glass. But the future was about to unravel before everyone's eyes. Margaret watched from afar, her cold eyes hiding secrets. She knew that night would be different. Inside her purse, she carried copies of contracts and invoices that could destroy her husband, not for revenge, but to ensure her own survival. Deep down, there was no longer love, only calculation. Emily, dressed in blue, looked out of place. She tried to smile, but her hands were shaking. She knew that part of the ruin of that night would be the result of her own mistake. The diary she had given away was no longer hers. Now every secret was ready to explode before a scandal-hungry audience. Daniel, in a dark suit, acted as if he were the official heir. He walked among the guests, greeting dignitaries, speaking of continuity, and insinuating his readiness to lead. But his words rang hollow. Many saw in him only the shadow of an eager son, willing to betray his own father to attain the throne. Suddenly, a journalist stood up, interrupting the violins. In his hands, he carried a black briefcase. His voice rang out clearly. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is proof that the Caldwell fortune was built on corruption and millions in bribes." Murmurs filled the room. Robert smiled nervously, but his heart was racing. Victor Hale, the lawyer, stepped forward to try to contain the situation. But the journalist opened his briefcase in front of the TV cameras. Photographs, contracts, bank records, all there, on the silver table. The flashbulbs began to flash. The lavish dinner was turning into a public tribunal. The gilded empire was beginning to crumble. Margaret, taking advantage of the chaos, approached the press. "I knew everything," she declared with calculated coldness. The cameras turned to her. Caldwell stared at her in disbelief. The coup didn't come just from politicians and associates. The poison was at home. The most painful betrayal came from the woman who had shared his life for decades. Daniel tried to take the microphone. "Don't get me wrong. The future of Caldwell Enterprises is in my hands." But his voice was drowned out by boos and laughter. To the audience, he was nothing more than another spoiled heir trying to save his own advantages. The crown he so desired was dissolving before their eyes. Emily couldn't handle the pressure. Tears streamed down her face as she confessed to those present. "I gave my diary to a journalist. I never imagined—" The words echoed like knives. Caldwell felt her world spin. The diary was the key to all her secrets. Her daughter had become an accomplice to her own destruction. Tensions were rising when, suddenly, the mansion doors burst open. Federal agents filed in, brandishing warrants. "Mr. Caldwell, you are hereby subpoenaed." Cameras filmed every second. The dinner became a national spectacle. Miami watched in real time the downfall of a tycoon who believed himself untouchable. The guests rose in shock. Some recorded the scene with their cell phones. Others tried to flee to avoid being associated with the scandal. The laughter and toasts turned to chaos. Caldwell, however, remained standing, motionless. He knew every gesture would be broadcast to the world. Silence was his last armor. Margaret took advantage of the confusion to discreetly disappear. Some swear they saw her getting into a black car, taking documents. Others say he left for Europe the next morning. What's certain is that she didn't look back that night. Her husband's fortune no longer mattered to her, only her own survival. Daniel ran to the agents, shouting that he should assume leadership of the empire. He was pushed aside, treated like an extra in the theater of ruin. Emily wept, hugging a friend, her strength gone. The luxurious dinner now seemed like a banquet for ghosts. The gold and crystal glittered like symbols of a hollow victory. Victor Hale mysteriously disappeared amid the chaos. When Caldwell looked around, the lawyer was gone. Some say he took important files, others that he had fled to avoid arrest. Robert silently understood. Even the man paid to protect him had abandoned ship. The cameras zoomed in on Caldwell as the officers placed handcuffs on his wrists. He held his head high, trying to maintain his dignity. "You think the truth won," he murmured. But his voice was drowned out by applause and boos. For the public, this was the end of a reign of corruption and dirty money. The magnate walked among the guests, now spectators of his downfall. Each step echoed in the marble corridors like the pounding of a court gavel. As he passed through the golden gates, he looked back. The mansion, illuminated, seemed to smile ironically. The empire he had built with secrets was now casting him out. As he left, flashbulbs blinded him. Reporters shouted questions. Microphones surrounded him like sharp blades. He didn't answer. He knew every word could be used against him. Silence was his last weapon, even if it was a broken one. Robert Caldwell, the king of Miami, was now a prisoner of his own luxury. The official cars departed to the roar of the crowd. Behind them, the mansion remained lit but empty. Memories of parties, contracts, and dinners echoed on the gilded walls. Now they were mere reminders of glory bought with corruption. The house, once a symbol of wealth, had become a monument to ruin. The next morning, newspapers across the country carried the same photo. Robert Caldwell, handcuffed, leaving his mansion. Headlines screamed in huge letters, "The King of Miami has fallen." The image spread around the world, becoming a symbol of downfall and shame. The hidden fortune was now exposed. In New York, TV analysts argued endlessly. One said Caldwell had been the victim of political enemies. Another said his downfall was inevitable, the result of decades of corruption. The public watched in fascination. It wasn't just news, it was spectacle. The downfall of a tycoon drew more viewers than any soap opera. Investors reacted with panic. Their companies' shares plummeted in minutes. Longtime partners broke contracts. Banks froze accounts and demanded audits. The empire, once valued in the billions, lost value like sand blown away by the wind. Fortunes built in shadows never withstand the light. The mansion was deathly silent. Employees abandoned their posts, fearing investigations. Hallways once filled with voices now echoed empty. Emily, huddled in her room, felt the weight of guilt. Daniel, furious, screamed into the phone, trying to save the business, but no one answered. Margaret was no longer there. Margaret had, in fact, embarked for Europe with hidden documents. While her family was falling apart, she was forging her own exit. In discreet Parisian cafes, she was already negotiating exclusive interviews and potential deals. The woman who had endured decades of silence was now turning secrets into currency. In Miami, crowds surrounded the mansion's gates. Posters with slogans like "Dirty money has a price" and "The truth always wins" were erected by protesters. Some demanded justice, others simply wanted to witness the end of a tycoon. Society, once fascinated by luxury, now thrived on ruin. An unexpected funeral also shook the news. Richard Evans, the missing business partner, was found dead under mysterious circumstances. His body was floating in a Miami canal. The gold watch still on his wrist confirmed his identity. The conspiracy was claiming lives. The case now involved not only corruption, but also bloodshed. During coverage of Evans' funeral, cameras caught Emily crying alone. Her red eyes betrayed sleepless nights. Comments on social media called her the daughter who betrayed her father. The young woman, lost in guilt and shame, became the target of a cruel public judgment. Daniel tried to keep up appearances, but every move was ridiculed. Newspapers nicknamed him Prince of Ashes. He, who had so desired the empire, was now only the heir to ruins. His steps were monitored by cameras, and every ill-judged word turned into a scandal. Meanwhile, in Washington, senators seized on Caldwell's downfall as fodder for speeches. "No tycoon is above the law," they shouted from the podium. Robert's arrest served as an example, but also as a political spectacle. Each word was another stone thrown at his name. In temporary detention, Caldwell received visits from lawyers. His hands trembled, but his voice remained steady. "I still have secrets," he would say, as if he could use the truth as a final weapon. But the system no longer had patience for negotiations. Now he was just another defendant on trial. TV channels rushed to produce documentaries. Catchy titles like Suja Fortune, The Remains of Robert Caldwell filled the nightclubs. Every detail was explored: parties, lovers, illegal contracts. The man who had controlled the narrative for decades was now a character in stories told by others. Emily, lost in shame, considered disappearing. Daniel, obsessed, searched for ways to salvage what was left, but his allies had evaporated. Margaret, cold, advanced in her new game. The family, once a showcase of success, was now synonymous with betrayal and disloyalty. The Caldwells were broke. The Caldwell companies couldn't resist. Luxury hotels were sold in a hurry. Unfinished projects were abandoned, symbols of frustrated ambition. What was once Miami's pride was now an urban scar. The fortune, built on corruption, was crumbling before everyone's eyes. At the cemetery, few people attended Evans's farewell. There were no grand speeches, only murmurs of fear. Everyone knew the conspiracy still had dark chapters to reveal. Caldwell, from prison, heard the news and muttered, "Even allies fall when secrets come to light." The media explored every detail. Reports showed images of empty coffers, torn-up contracts and frozen accounts. The public, mesmerized, watched without mercy. The fall of a tycoon wasn't just news, it was entertainment, and Robert Caldwell had become the protagonist of this American tragedy. Margaret, in Paris, smiled when she saw the headline, "Ex-wife may be key to Caldwell investigation." She understood that her survival depended on becoming a witness, not an accomplice. The documents she kept were her life insurance. Once again, secrets became the currency of salvation. Meanwhile, Daniel and Emily found themselves in the abandoned mansion. Within silent walls, they discussed what was left of their family. "Father destroyed everything," he said. "No, we did it too," she replied in tears. For the first time, they recognized that the fortune had been lost not only to corruption, but also to internal betrayal. In the cell reserved for high-profile prisoners, Caldwell found what they called comforts: a clean bed, a wooden table, an antique lamp. But to him, every gilded detail was a cruel irony. This wasn't luxury, it was a prison painted the colors of lost fortune. He spent hours staring at the walls. In his mind, he could still hear the applause of parties, the clink of crystal glasses, the promises of eternal power. Now, the only sound was the echo of his own thoughts. Caldwell discovered that silence could be more cutting than any accusation. At night, he dreamed of his mansion. He saw the chandeliers shining, the illuminated hallways, Margaret smiling from afar. But when he woke, everything dissolved into cold concrete and golden railings. The contrast drove him mad. His fortune, which had once been an invisible prison, now became a palpable nightmare. His lawyers visited him with increasingly dire news. Accounts were frozen, assets were auctioned, friends disappeared. Caldwell pretended to be unfazed, but inside he felt every piece of his empire crumbling like a tower of cards. The Golden King was now a prisoner of papers and sentences. Time seemed to stand still. He counted seconds, minutes, hours. Each tick of the distant clock was a cruel reminder that freedom had evaporated. Caldwell, accustomed to controlling everyone's time, now had no control over even his own destiny. His paranoia grew. He believed even his guards were plotting against him. He listened to their whispers, convinced he was being plotted to hand him over to his enemies. Caldwell began writing encrypted notes, hiding them under his bed. Were they escape plans? Confessions? Perhaps just the ravings of a broken man? The ghosts of his family haunted him. He saw Emily weeping before him, Daniel demanding the empire, Margaret disappearing silently. Each face was a reminder of the betrayals he had sown and reaped. Caldwell finally understood that the fortune hadn't been stolen, it had been corroded from within. The golden cell was the stage for his afterthoughts. He muttered phrases like, "Fortune always calls in its dues." Guards listened to him and exchanged glances, uncomprehending. For Caldwell, this wasn't just a physical prison, it was a spiritual trial. The weight of secrets weighed heavily on his shoulders. The nights were worse. He heard footsteps in the hallway and believed they were coming to kill him. Every shadow was a threat, every noise a conspiracy. Caldwell, who had lived by buying silence, was now devoured by his own fear. The man who claimed to be invincible trembled before invisible ghosts. Even in ruin, he maintained one habit. He dressed in the best clothes allowed, combed his hair, and stared at the cracked mirror in his cell. He wanted to appear dignified even without his fortune. But in the reflection, he no longer saw the Miami tycoon, just a gilded prisoner caged in memories. And so Caldwell realized the ultimate truth. His empire had not been destroyed solely by enemies or authorities. It was his own ambition, his insatiable hunger for power and wealth that had doomed him. Prison was not punishment, it was simply the inevitable reflection of the life he had chosen to live. Outside, drones hovered over the empty mansion. The same golden gate that once welcomed politicians and celebrities now creaked and rusted. The image was splashed across the news, connecting past and present. The initial scene of glory was transformed into a symbol of decline. The cycle was complete. In his final testimony, Caldwell held his head high and said, "You'll never understand. Wealth is a gilded prison." The words echoed throughout the courtroom, reminding everyone that his ruin was not only financial, but also spiritual. The audience applauded like those watching the finale of an inevitable tragedy. Margaret, far away in Paris, read the headline with a restrained smile. Emily sank into silence and guilt as Daniel tried to rebuild something from the ashes, but nothing that remained could be called an empire. The fortune, once a treasure, was now just a memory corroded by secrets and betrayals. Society moved on, but Robert Caldwell's story became an urban legend in Miami. Some said his voice could still be heard in the hallways of the abandoned mansion. Others said secret vaults remained buried. The only certainty was corruption always leaves deep scars. And so the cycle closed. From the glitter of parties to the silence of cells, the hidden fortune revealed itself as a curse. The moral echoed like a final sentence. Greed destroys, the truth always comes to light, and dirty money doesn't buy eternity. Caldwell fell, but his fall would remain a warning to all. Robert Caldwell's story shows that no fortune, no matter how great, can survive when built on corruption. His empire was brought down not only by enemies, but by the sum total of secrets and betrayals from within. The glitter of gold never erased the darkness growing within his own home. Every illegal contract, every bribe paid, every silence bought was a stone in the wall of his prison. Caldwell believed he controlled everything, but he forgot the simplest lesson. The truth always finds a way to emerge, and when it does, no fortune, safe or power can contain it. Perhaps the cruelest thing is to realize that his downfall didn't begin in court, nor at the final party, but long before, on the day he believed himself above any law. Greed not only blinded him, but also took with it his family, his friends, and the entire legacy that could have been greatness. Stories like his aren't just a thing of the past. How many tycoons, politicians, and heirs still try to hide secrets under mountains of dirty money? How many empires seem indestructible, but are actually built on quicksand? The lesson is clear. Fortune without honor is certain ruin, and if you've made it this far, it's because you understand the power of these stories. So don't stop now. Stay with us on Hidden Fortunes, where each episode reveals new secrets, downfalls, and conspiracies from the world of tycoons. Subscribe, ring the bell, and find out. The next hidden fortune may be closer than you think.